Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The Quiet Disruption. The village of St. Mary Mead was as peaceful as ever that evening, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The day had been warm, with a light breeze rustling through the trees, and as dusk fell, the village felt as though it were in a timeless slumber, the perfect picture of rural tranquility. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place, where the pace of life was slow and steady, and the most exciting event in a day might be Mrs. Finch's new knitting pattern or the latest gossip about the Wentworth's new housekeeper. But that evening, the calm was shattered in the most unexpected way. It began with a scream, sharp and unrelenting. The kind of scream that seemed to pierce the air itself. It echoed down the narrow lanes, startling the village's residents who had been preparing for bed or finishing up their evening chores. The source of the scream was quickly identified as coming from the large, well-kept manor at the edge of the village, the home of Sir George Collingwood. Sir George was a man of quiet repute, known for his large family estate and his charitable contributions to the village. His manor was the kind of place people whispered about, full of history and wealth. It wasn't often that the Collingwoods were at the center of gossip, and when they were, it was usually for something grand, weddings, parties, or some charity event. But the scream shattered all notions of civility and propriety. Miss Marple had been sitting in her cozy living room, knitting as the evening's shadows lengthened, when the sound reached her ears. It was a sound that she had heard too many times in her long life, an unmistakable cry for help. She had known it well during her years of observation, though it had never come from this direction before. Without hesitation, Miss Marple stood up, placed her knitting on the table, and made her way out into the cool evening air. The village was quiet again, as if it had only been a collective gasp at the sudden, unprovoked noise. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew that such a disturbance was far from ordinary. A scream in the night could only mean one thing: something was terribly wrong. By the time Miss Marple reached Sir George's manor, the scene had already begun to unfold. A small crowd had gathered outside, murmuring in shock. The constable, young and inexperienced, stood at the front, trying his best to maintain order. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly as he spoke with the household staff. Inside the house, the Collingwood family had already begun to gather, their faces taut with the tension of something they could not quite understand. Miss Marple approached the constable quietly, as always, and he looked up at her with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, "I'm afraid there's been a murder." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. "A murder, you say? Well, I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised. A scream like that hardly sounds like a simple accident." The constable looked at her, his eyes wide. "It's Sir George, Miss Marple. We found him in his study. He's been stabbed." Miss Marple's expression softened as she nodded slowly. She had seen more than enough of human nature in her life to know what a simple, violent death meant to the small town of St. Mary Mead. It would ripple through the community like a stone dropped into still water, and everyone would have their theories. The real work, however, was always in the details, the things people didn't say, the little clues that slipped past unnoticed. That was where Miss Marple excelled, and as the constable began speaking with the staff again, Miss Marple entered the house with a calm demeanor, her mind already starting to work on the case. The study where Sir George's body had been found was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the twilight. The room was lined with bookshelves, and a large mahogany desk sat near the center, papers scattered across it in an untidy fashion. The body of Sir George was slumped in his chair, the life drained from him, his pale face staring vacantly at the ceiling. The wound on his chest was deep, and the blood had already begun to pool beneath him, staining the rich carpet. It was clear that the murder had been quick, violent, and, given the lack of signs of struggle, probably unexpected. Miss Marple stepped into the room, her gaze flicking over the scene with practiced eyes. She noted the papers on the desk, though none of them seemed to offer much of a clue. A letter was half opened, and a fountain pen rested on the edge of the desk, as though Sir George had been writing something in the moments before his death. The room was eerily still, save for the low murmur of the constable and his men talking in the hallway. She circled the room, taking in the subtle details, the slightly open window, the untouched teacup on a nearby table, and the absence of any signs of a forced entry. It all seemed too calm, too staged. Miss Marple's instincts told her this wasn't a random crime. It was personal. And if it was personal, then it meant the killer was someone who knew Sir George, someone who had access to him. The family had already been gathered in the drawing room, and as Miss Marple made her way there, she felt the weight of their stares as she entered. Sir George's wife, Lady Eleanor, was seated with a handkerchief pressed to her face, her shoulders trembling. His son, Andrew, was pacing back and forth, his face a mix of disbelief and frustration. The housekeeper, Mrs. Griffin, stood quietly by the fireplace, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple took a seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She observed them all quietly, allowing the tension in the room to grow. It was a skill of hers, one she had honed over many years, to remain silent when others were most eager to fill the air with their own theories. "Well, Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor said, her voice shaky but sharp, "do you have any thoughts on what happened to my husband?" Miss Marple looked at the grieving widow with calm, unflinching eyes. "I'm afraid I haven't yet come to any conclusions, Lady Eleanor. But I do believe that the answers lie somewhere in the family's past. A crime like this is never random. It's always tied to something personal, something that's been brewing beneath the surface." Andrew Collingwood, Sir George's son, couldn't contain his agitation. "Are you saying that one of us did this? That one of us killed my father?" Miss Marple's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "I'm not saying anything yet, Mr. Collingwood. But I do know that in cases like this, it's often the people closest to the victim who have the most to hide. And someone in this house might know more than they're letting on." The room fell silent, and Miss Marple took that moment to study each of their faces. As she sat back, taking in every nuance of their expressions, she knew the truth was close. Very close. The quiet of night had been broken, and in the stillness of the house, Miss Marple would find the answer. But she had no intention of revealing it just yet. She would wait for the right moment, as always. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead was still in shock. News of Sir George Collingwood's murder had spread like wildfire, and though most of the villagers tried to go about their routines, the air felt different, thick with uncertainty and whispered speculation. Miss Marple had always believed that in moments like this, it was essential to let the gossip and the theories run their course. She had seen it many times before. When tragedy struck, the village would rally around it, each person offering their own interpretation of what had happened. But it wasn't the gossip that Miss Marple sought. It was the quiet, unspoken truths that lay hidden beneath the surface in the actions and reactions of the people involved. After her visit to Sir George's manor, Miss Marple spent the morning walking through the village, observing the subtle changes in behavior that often revealed more than words ever could. It was early still, the sun barely risen above the rooftops, and the streets were dotted with familiar faces, some hurrying to complete their daily tasks, others lingering outside their cottages, exchanging the latest news. As Miss Marple passed Mrs. Finch's bakery, the door swung open, and the widow herself appeared, shaking her head and muttering something under her breath. Miss Marple stopped and gave her a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch," she said. "I trust you're well?" Mrs. Finch paused, her eyes narrowing as she took in Miss Marple's calm demeanor. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You heard, didn't you? The poor Collingwood family. Terrible business, isn't it? Who would do such a thing?" "I'm afraid I don't know yet, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "But I'm sure the constable will find out soon enough." Mrs. Finch leaned in, lowering her voice further. "Well, I hear there's already talk that it was one of the servants, a quarrel gone wrong, or perhaps someone had a grudge against Sir George for some business dealings. I wouldn't be surprised if it was one of them." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Gossip, as always, was quick to offer an explanation, especially when it involved someone of the Collingwood stature. It was always easier to blame those who were seen as outsiders, the staff or the less fortunate, than to entertain the possibility that someone within the family could be responsible. "I'll keep an ear to the ground, Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch continued, "but something tells me we haven't heard the last of this." Miss Marple smiled politely. "I'm sure you're right, Mrs. Finch, and thank you for your insights." As she continued her walk, Miss Marple's mind was already turning. The idea of a servant being involved was not entirely out of the question. Many families in the village had hidden resentments that could easily boil over into violence, but Miss Marple knew better than to accept any theory without evidence. She needed to understand the dynamics within the Collingwood family first. They were at the center of this mystery, and it was from them that the truth would emerge. As the day progressed, Miss Marple made her way to the Collingwood estate once again. She had already spoken briefly to the constable the previous evening, but today she hoped to speak directly with the family. She had no doubt that they were deeply shaken, but she also knew that in times of crisis, people often revealed more than they intended. The constable had been too quick to assume that the murder was an isolated incident. Miss Marple suspected it was far more complex than that. When she arrived at the manor, the mood was somber. Lady Eleanor Collingwood, Sir George's widow, was sitting in the drawing-room, her eyes swollen from crying. Andrew, the son, was pacing restlessly, his face a mask of frustration. The servants, meanwhile, seemed unusually quiet, their eyes darting nervously as they went about their work. Miss Marple approached the family with a soft step, her presence almost unnoticed at first. She had learned long ago that it was often best to let people speak first, to let them share what they were willing to, without the pressure of direct questioning. "Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple began gently, "I am so sorry for your loss. I know this is a difficult time, but I was hoping you could help me understand a bit more about Sir George. Lady Eleanor looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple, I, I don't understand any of it. George was a good man, a kind man. Why would anyone want to hurt him? Her voice trembled, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. I'm sure you must have many questions, Miss Marple replied quietly. But sometimes, in times of grief, it helps to look at the details, the things that don't seem important at first. Was Sir George worried about anything recently? Anything at all that seemed out of place? Lady Eleanor shook her head, her expression distant. No, no. George was always calm, always in control. I can't think of anyone who would want to harm him. But he had a lot of dealings, you know, with people in the village. Business, I suppose. There were a few tense moments with certain individuals, but nothing that ever seemed serious. Miss Marple's ears perked up at the mention of tense moments. Who were these individuals, Lady Eleanor? I don't know, Lady Eleanor stammered. Some of his associates from the past. Old business dealings. But that's not important, Miss Marple. George never shared details like that with me. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting the way Lady Eleanor's voice had faltered when she mentioned her husband's business dealings. She turned to Andrew, who had been pacing nearby, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Andrew, Miss Marple said gently, I understand this is difficult, but I must ask. Did your father ever mention anyone who might have had reason to harm him? Anyone who might have wanted him out of the way? Andrew stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. No, he didn't. Father was well respected. People liked him. There's no reason at all, why anyone would want to hurt him. His voice was almost pleading, and Miss Marple saw the strain in his eyes. It was clear that he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. I understand, Andrew, Miss Marple said softly. But sometimes, people are not always what they seem. The truth, as always, is hidden beneath the surface. Andrew's eyes darted toward the door, as though looking for a way out. I don't know what you're suggesting, Miss Marple, but I'll have no part in it. My father was a good man, and I won't let anyone say otherwise. Miss Marple regarded him quietly, her expression unreadable. I'm not suggesting anything, Andrew. I'm simply asking questions, and sometimes it is those who are closest to the victim who can shed light on the truth. Andrew stared at her for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lady Eleanor sat back in her chair, her face drawn with exhaustion. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, but she said nothing. The widow's reaction had spoken volumes. The family was not as united as they seemed. There were tensions, unspoken secrets, and resentments. And Miss Marple was beginning to believe that these hidden dynamics held the key to understanding Sir George's death. Miss Marple stood up, her hands folded neatly in front of her. I will, of course, continue my investigation, she said gently. But I would suggest you remain cautious, Lady Eleanor. It's always the things that people are reluctant to speak about that often hold the answers. Chapter 3. Early investigation, the village of St. Mary Mead was still reeling from the shock of Sir George Collingwood's murder. Gossip had spread like wildfire, with every villager offering their own theory on what had happened. Miss Marple, however, knew that the truth would not be found in the idle chatter of the village. She needed to look beyond the surface and observe the subtle details, the ones that others missed. After her conversation with Lady Eleanor and Andrew, Miss Marple had a clearer sense of the tension within the Collingwood household. There were many questions that remained unanswered. Questions about Sir George's business dealings, about the relationships that had soured over time, and about the secrets that had been carefully kept behind the walls of the manor. But there was one thing that Miss Marple was certain of. Someone in that house knew more than they were letting on. That evening, she took a walk through the village, her mind turning over the details she had gathered so far. The village was still, quiet. The streets empty except for a few late-night walkers and the occasional farmer finishing up a day's work. The stars had begun to twinkle above, casting a gentle glow on the cobblestones. As Miss Marple strolled along, her thoughts drifted to the old records of Sir George's family, the business dealings that had gone back generations. She suspected that these dealings were at the heart of the mystery. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the local library. She had heard that Sir George had been involved in many charitable causes, and had even written a few articles on local history, which had been archived in the village's small collection. Miss Marple hoped to find some clue, some hint about Sir George's past that might shed light on his murder. The librarian, Mrs. Thorne, was a pleasant woman with a knack for remembering details. She greeted Miss Marple warmly as she entered, though there was an air of sadness about her, as the village had lost one of its prominent members. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Thorne said, adjusting her spectacles. "What brings you here today? I imagine you've already heard the news." "I have indeed," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat at one of the tables. "I'm afraid I'm here for more than just gossip. I was hoping to look into some of Sir George's past writings, specifically any articles or records he might have kept related to his family's business dealings. I believe there might be a connection between his public work and his more private matters." Mrs. Thorne's expression shifted slightly, her brow furrowing. "I see. Well, Sir George was always very private about his personal affairs, but I do have a few of his papers. If you think they'll help?" "I believe they will," Miss Marple said with a quiet nod. "If you don't mind, I'd like to take a look." Mrs. Thorne led Miss Marple to a back corner of the library, where a set of old, leather-bound volumes were stored in an oak cabinet. "Here they are," she said, unlocking the cabinet with a small key. "These are the records of Sir George's writings. He contributed to many of the village's publications over the years, particularly during his younger days." Miss Marple skimmed through the collection, her fingers brushing against the pages as she searched for something that might hint at the darker side of Sir George's life. Most of the writings were indeed focused on local history, charity work, and the preservation of the estate. But as she reached the last few volumes, one particular article caught her attention. It was dated just a few months before his death, and it was titled, "The Legacy of the Darby Estate, A Forgotten History." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The Darby family. She had heard the name mentioned in passing by several villagers, but she had never thought much of it. Now, it seemed, the Darbys were somehow connected to the mystery of Sir George's death. She pulled the article from the shelf and began reading, her eyes scanning the words quickly. The article was a reflection on the history of the Darby estate, which had once been one of the largest in the region. However, over the years, the estate had been sold off in parts, and the family had faded into obscurity. Sir George's article spoke about the financial troubles that had led to the estate's collapse, hinting at some shady dealings and questionable decisions made by previous generations of the Darby family. The article was well written, but there was an underlying tone of caution in Sir George's words. He seemed to be hinting at something more than just the financial decline of the Darby family. There were mentions of old debts, deals that had been made under the table, and promises that had been broken. It was clear that Sir George knew more about the Darby family than he had let on. And, perhaps, he had uncovered something recently that someone wanted to keep hidden. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, deep in thought. She had found the connection she had been looking for. The Darby estate, with its long-buried secrets, was at the center of this mystery. But why had Sir George been murdered? Had he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have? And who in the village was willing to kill to keep those secrets hidden? As she closed the article, Miss Marple's mind began to piece together the next steps of her investigation. She would need to speak to the Darbys, or at least to anyone who had known them, or been involved in their financial affairs. But there was something more. She felt it in her bones. The answer wasn't just about uncovering the Darby family's history. There was someone in St. Mary Mead, someone with much to lose, who was desperate to protect those secrets at any cost. Miss Marple rose from her chair, tucking the article into her bag. "Thank you, Mrs. Thorne," she said, turning to the librarian. "This has been most helpful. If there's anything else I can do—" Mrs. Thorne began, but Miss Marple was already heading toward the door. "I'll let you know," Miss Marple replied, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "But I believe I'm getting closer." As Miss Marple left the library, she knew that the key to Sir George's murder was now within reach. She had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but the rest would take patience, observation, and, most importantly, understanding the human behavior behind the facade. St. Mary Mead had long been a village of secrets, and Miss Marple was ready to peel back the layers and expose the truth hidden beneath them. Chapter 4. The first suspects. The days following Sir George Collingwood's murder were filled with hushed conversations and anxious whispers, but Miss Marple remained undisturbed by the chaos that surrounded her. With each new piece of information she uncovered, her understanding of the crime deepened, but she knew that the mystery was far from solved. The Darby estate had emerged as a key element, but the question remained, who in this peaceful village had the motive to kill Sir George and bury the past so violently? Miss Marple's next step was to return to the Collingwood Manor. She had already spoken to Lady Eleanor and Andrew, but there were still unanswered questions. Her instincts told her that the key to this mystery lay in the intricate web of family dynamics, old grudges, and the secrets Sir George had uncovered about the Darby family. With these suspicions in mind, Miss Marple arranged another visit to the manor, this time to speak with the household staff. The constable, still eager to maintain control of the investigation, had already begun to question everyone in the house, but Miss Marple felt that the staff, those who worked in the background, might know more than they let on. After all, it was often the most overlooked members of a household who held the most knowledge, whether they realized it or not. Upon arriving at the manor, Miss Marple made her way to the servants' quarters, a small, dimly lit part of the house that smelled faintly of polish and herbs. She knocked gently on the door, and when it was answered by Mrs. Griffin, the housekeeper, she was invited in. "Good morning, Mrs. Griffin," Miss Marple said, offering her a polite smile as she stepped inside. "I trust you're well." Mrs. Griffin, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded sharply, but said nothing at first. She had worked for the Collingwoods for years, and Miss Marple could see that she was still processing the shock of the murder. "Not much sleep for anyone around here these days, Miss Marple," Mrs. Griffin said with a sigh, as she led the way to a small sitting area. "We're all quite shaken up. Poor Sir George. Who would have thought?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, sitting down across from the housekeeper. "It's such a terrible thing. I understand you've been with the family for a long time?" "L'Encrease. Enough to know a thing or two about the goings-on, yes," Mrs. Griffin replied, a hint of weariness in her voice. "But I won't pretend to understand this, Miss Marple. Sir George was well liked by everyone here. He was a good man. He provided for us, treated us well. Not that it helps now." Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the quiet sincerity in her words, but also the slight nervousness in her posture. The housekeeper, despite her years of service, seemed unsettled. It was not unusual for someone to be disturbed after such an event, but Miss Marple knew better than to take everything at face value. There was something more here. "I'm sure you must be feeling unsettled, Mrs. Griffin," Miss Marple said softly, her voice soothing. "But perhaps you could tell me about the family, their relationships. I'm sure Sir George was a kind master, but was there ever any tension, perhaps between Sir George and other people in the household?" Mrs. Griffin's eyes widened slightly, and Miss Marple could see her trying to decide whether or not to share what she knew. After a brief moment, the housekeeper sighed. Sir George was a man who had his fair share of arguments, though nothing violent. Most of the time, it was business, the estate's upkeep, matters with the tenants, things like that. But there were times when he had strong words with Andrew. Not often, but when they did argue, it was about the future of the estate. Sir George wanted to keep the family's name intact, keep things proper. But Andrew, well, he's not the same as his father. There's a certain restlessness about him. He doesn't have the same patience for the family business. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Restlessness? What do you mean?" Mrs. Griffin hesitated before speaking again, her voice lowering. "I don't know, Miss Marple. Andrews always seemed a bit difficult, if you ask me. Not in a violent way, mind you, but he has a temper. And ever since his father began looking into those old Darby family matters, things have been tense. I've overheard arguments between them, Andrew saying that the estate needed a new direction, that Sir George's way of doing things was outdated. And Sir George, well, he didn't take kindly to that sort of talk." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. This was the first hint she had that Andrew might be more involved than he had let on. She had already noticed his frustration when they had spoken earlier, and now it seemed that there was more to his behavior than simple grief. "Thank you, Mrs. Griffin," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "You've been very helpful. I'm sure you've had your share of stress. Yes, lately. But I believe there is one more question I must ask. Do you know if Sir George had any reason to fear someone close to him? Any threats, perhaps? Or someone who might have been desperate to stop him from uncovering the past?" Mrs. Griffin's face remained unreadable, but her hands fidgeted in her lap. "I can't say for certain, Miss Marple. But if Sir George was getting too close to something he shouldn't have, well, I wouldn't be surprised if someone decided to act to protect their interests. This village, there are old ways, you know. Some people would rather keep certain things buried." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. It was clear, now that the situation was more complicated than she had originally assumed. Andrew's strained relationship with his father, combined with the ongoing tensions over the estate, painted a picture of a man who might have felt that his future was in jeopardy. But Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions. There were still too many questions left unanswered. As she left the servants' quarters and made her way back to the main house, Miss Marple's mind was busy with the new information she had gathered. Andrew Collingwood was a man with potential motives, but there were other elements at play. Hidden forces, old grievances, and perhaps even secrets that stretched back further than the family could imagine. Miss Marple knew that the time had come to dig deeper. The answers she sought were not just about Sir George's death. They were tied to the long-hidden history of the Collingwood family. And as she stood at the threshold of the manor once again, she was more certain than ever that the truth would come from understanding the relationships, the old business dealings, and the quiet resentments that had festered in the shadows for so long. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead had darkened by the time Miss Marple finished her conversation with Mrs. Griffin. Her mind was spinning with the new revelations. The idea that Andrew Collingwood's frustrations with his father, combined with the tension surrounding Sir George's investigation into the Darby family, were at the heart of the mystery, began to seem more plausible. But there was still something that didn't quite add up. Miss Marple was not yet convinced that Andrew was the sole figure responsible for the murder. There was another piece, perhaps hidden beneath the surface, that she had yet to uncover. As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, she reflected on the pieces of the puzzle she had gathered so far. Sir George had been close to uncovering something dangerous, something tied to the Darby estate's long-buried financial secrets. It seemed as though Sir George's investigation into these matters had ruffled some feathers, particularly among those with a vested interest in keeping the past hidden. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more certain she became that the answer wasn't simply about family conflict or inheritance. It was about power and the protection of long-held secrets. The next morning, as the village slowly came to life, Miss Marple set out for her next stop, the village archives. The Darby family, despite its diminished status in recent years, had left a significant mark on the history of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple knew that the local archives would contain records of the estate, as well as details about the family's financial troubles. She hoped that by diving into the past, she could find the final clue that would tie the pieces together. The village archives were located in the old church, a place that had long served as a repository for local history. The room was small, tucked away behind a dusty corridor, but it contained an extensive collection of records, maps, and documents. Miss Marple made her way inside, greeted by the familiar scent of old paper and the quiet stillness of the space. "Morning, Miss Marple," called the village archivist, a pleasant woman named Miss Denton. "Back for more history lessons?" "I suppose you could say that, Miss Denton," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I'm hoping to find a few more clues about the Darby family. Specifically, anything to do with their business dealings." Miss Denton's expression changed slightly, as though she were considering the request carefully. "The Darby family's history is complicated, to say the least. You know they sold off most of the estate a few decades ago, don't you?" "I'm aware," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but purposeful. "But I believe there may be more to their story than has been shared. Something that connects them to Sir George Collingwood's death." Miss Denton's eyebrows shot up in Taivu surprise. "Well, I don't know if I can help with that, but I can certainly show you what we've got. There are a few records that might be of interest." She led Miss Marple to a wooden table, where several dusty ledgers and old legal documents were laid out. Miss Marple settled herself into a chair, taking a moment to study the materials. She sifted through the papers, carefully scanning the details. The Darby family had indeed been deeply involved in the estate's management. Once wealthy landowners who had seen their fortunes dwindle over the years due to poor investments, and, as Miss Marple had suspected, some shady business dealings. What caught her attention, however, was a set of papers from the late 1920s. The records indicated that the Darbys had entered into a series of secretive financial transactions which had been sealed and hidden from the public eye. As Miss Marple flipped through the documents, one particular entry stood out. A letter written by a prominent solicitor at the time, suggesting that the Darbys had been involved in a high-stakes loan deal with Sir George Collingwood's family. The loan, it seemed, had been linked to the Darby estate's last major transaction before they sold off the majority of their land. But there was something more in the letter, something that caught Miss Marple's eye. The solicitor's letter referenced a clandestine agreement between the Darbys and the Collingwoods. It was clear that, though the two families had long since severed ties, the agreement had been made to protect the Collingwoods' interests in case the Darby estate collapsed. But the details of that agreement, how the Collingwoods had been involved, were not fully explained. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. This was the clue she had been waiting for, the key to understanding the link between Sir George's death and the Darby family's past. There was something in that agreement, something hidden between the lines, that had the potential to blow the lid off the mystery. Sir George had been trying to uncover it, and someone had clearly wanted to stop him from doing so. But who? "Miss Denton," Miss Marple said after a moment of quiet reflection. "I believe I'll need to take these records with me for a while. There's something very important here, and I think I'm on the verge of something crucial." Miss Denton hesitated, but after a brief moment, she nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple, but you'll have to be careful with these. They're quite old, and some of the paper is fragile." "I'll be as careful as I can," Miss Marple assured her, gathering the documents and tucking them carefully into her bag. "Thank you for your help, Miss Denton. You've provided me with exactly what I needed." As Miss Marple walked out of the archives, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. The Darby family's secret dealings, their long-buried connection to the Collingwoods, were now within her reach. But there was still so much to uncover. The true extent of the financial arrangement, the involvement of the key players in the village, and, most importantly, who stood to gain from Sir George's death. She had no doubt that this mystery would soon unravel, and that the truth was closer than ever. But the final pieces, those that would reveal the true murderer, were still hidden, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. Chapter 6. A Hidden Clue. The days following her discovery in the archives passed quietly, but Miss Marple was far from at ease. The connection between the Darby family's financial dealings and Sir George Collingwood's murder had been established, but there were still many unanswered questions. The more she pondered the case, the more she realized that there were layers to the mystery, layers that even the villagers themselves might not fully understand. It wasn't just a matter of old debts or old money. The true motives for Sir George's murder lay deeper, embedded in the lives of those who had known him. Miss Marple had already questioned many of the village's inhabitants, and yet the true culprit remained elusive. Even Andrew Collingwood, who had appeared to be the most likely suspect, still held a veil of uncertainty over him. His strained relationship with his father was evident, and his outbursts and temper seemed to be too obvious to be the real motive. No, Miss Marple thought, there was more to this than just a personal vendetta. She needed to focus on the smaller details, the things that people didn't want to be seen. It was with this in mind that she decided to visit the manor again. Sir George's study, where the murder had taken place, still held a strange, unnerving air about it. The servants had cleaned the area, but there was a lingering heaviness that couldn't be erased. Miss Marple knew that something had been left behind in that room, something small but vital that had yet to be discovered. When she arrived, she was greeted by the butler, who led her upstairs to the study. The room was as it had been before, the furniture now arranged as it was in the moments before Sir George had been found dead. It was an eerily quiet space, the kind of room that one could easily overlook in the search for answers. But Miss Marple was not one to overlook the obvious. She started at the desk, slowly running her hands over the papers, noting each detail with quiet precision. The same letter, half opened, sat on the desk, and the fountain pen lay undisturbed, near the edge of the table. But it was the small things that caught Miss Marple's attention. A half-drawn curtain left slightly ajar, a faint scent of ink still lingering in the air, the faint indentation on the chair as if someone had left it in haste. She circled the room, her eyes scanning every inch, when she noticed something unusual near the corner of the room. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a misplaced book. A leather-bound ledger sat on the floor, half hidden under a chair, as though it had been pushed aside in a hurry. Miss Marple knelt down and pulled it out, noticing immediately that it seemed heavier than it should be. She opened it carefully, her fingers skimming the pages. It was filled with accounts, financial records of transactions made on behalf of Sir George Collingwood. But it was the final few pages that stood out to her. There, in a that appeared to be hastily written, were more details about the Darby family estate. These were not public records or debts that were listed in any formal account. No, these were personal transactions, records of private loans made by Sir George, transactions that were never reported, loans taken under false names, and agreements that seemed to indicate a much more intimate involvement with the Darby family than anyone had been led to believe. One particular entry caught her eye, an unsigned note scribbled in the margin of the ledger. Meet at midnight to discuss final terms. Payment must be made to the usual account. Do not involve the family. If you cannot proceed, we will have no choice but to go public. It was the phrase, "if you cannot proceed," that sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. She could imagine Sir George, caught between his moral compass and the weight of these hidden dealings, trying to resolve matters quietly, without drawing attention. But these records suggested that there was someone else, someone with far more to lose, who had a reason to silence him before he could finish his investigation. Miss Marple closed the ledger with care, her mind racing. There was something in these notes, something that had been intended to remain hidden, perhaps even from Sir George himself. He had been too close to uncovering it, but someone had ensured he would never finish his work. As she tucked the ledger into her bag, Miss Marple took one last look around the room. The pieces were starting to fit together. Sir George had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple financial arrangement. These dealings were not just about the Darby estate. They were about power, manipulation, and the lengths that people would go to in order to protect their interests. And in that room, Miss Marple knew that the killer had left a trail that would lead her to the person who had the most to gain from Sir George's silence. Miss Marple left the study, her mind focused on the next step. She needed to speak with the people who had the most to lose, those with the deepest connections to Sir George's dealings. She had already spoken with the Collingwoods, but there was more to uncover. The next step would take her deeper into the village's past, where old relationships and hidden alliances had been forged. And she had a feeling that it would be those relationships, those quiet connections, that would provide the answers she sought. As she walked back toward the village, the weight of the ledger heavy in her bag, Miss Marple knew that the next of the mystery was about to unfold. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Secrets. The evening grew colder as Miss Marple left Sir George Collingwood's manor, the ledger tucked carefully under her arm. She had seen enough to know that the surface of this mystery was just the beginning. The deeper she went, the more tangled the web became, and she suspected that the truth would not be uncovered through mere questions and answers. No, it would take careful observation and quiet confrontation. It was time to speak to those who had the most to lose, to those who had the most at stake in keeping Sir George's investigation quiet. The sun had dipped below the horizon when Miss Marple made her way toward the village square. Her first stop was at the local inn, where the constable had set up a temporary base for his investigation. Though the police had been diligent in their questioning, Miss Marple knew that the answers lay in the lives of those who had the power to shape events, those who had hidden motives and secrets they desperately needed to keep buried. Upon entering the inn, Miss Marple found Constable Pierce poring over his notes at a small corner table. His expression was one of frustration, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The young constable had, for the most part, done his best to piece together what had happened, but Miss Marple could see that he was struggling. He was a man of good intentions, but little experience, and she knew that the answers would not come from the obvious suspects. They would come from understanding the subtleties of human nature, the quiet tensions that simmered beneath the surface. "Good evening, Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice light, though she could sense the unease in the room. Pierce looked up, startled at first, but a slight relief washed over his face when he saw who it was. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was just going over some notes from the interviews. It's all a bit of a muddle, really. No one seems to know anything that helps." Miss Marple smiled kindly and took a seat across from him. "I understand, Constable. It's always the way with these things. Everyone's got an idea, but no one's willing to admit the truth. Have you had a chance to speak to all of the staff at the Collingwood Manor?" "I've spoken to most of them," Pierce said, rubbing his temples, "but none of them seem to know anything useful. Mrs. Griffin, the housekeeper, said Sir George didn't have any enemies, and the rest of the servants are as clueless as the rest of us. It's all so frustrating." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps the truth lies not in what they've told you, but in what they haven't said." Pierce looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Consider this," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but sure. "You've asked the housekeeper and the staff about Sir George's relationships, his possible enemies, haven't you?" "I have," he replied, "but no one seems to have any good answers. It's as if Sir George was well liked by all." "And yet someone killed him," Miss Marple pointed out. "I'd wager that there's more to these relationships than mere friendliness. What if Sir George wasn't just a well-liked man? What if there were debts, hidden arrangements, deals that no one wants to talk about?" Pierce sat back, clearly deep in thought. "But if someone had a reason to kill him, they'd have confessed, wouldn't they? Or at least given us something useful?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, her gaze distant as she considered the situation. "Not if they were trying to protect something larger. What's in it for them to admit to a crime that could destroy their entire future?" Pierce shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I hadn't thought of it like that." "That's why I'm here," Miss Marple said with a quiet smile, "to help you see the things others miss. You may have overlooked something important. I'd like to speak to the Collingwoods once more. They've been less than forthcoming, and, I believe, the family's ties to the Derby estate are far deeper than anyone has admitted." Pierce frowned. "But we've already questioned them." "I'm not here to ask the same questions," Miss Marple replied, rising from her seat. "I'm here to ask the right ones." By the time Miss Marple returned to the Collingwood Manor, the evening had fully settled into night. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and the servants had long finished their duties for the day. Miss Marple found Lady Eleanor and Andrew in the drawing-room, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and quiet dread. The weight of Sir George's death hung heavy in the air, and Miss Marple could feel it in every glance exchanged between the two. Lady Eleanor sat at the piano, her hands resting idly on the keys. Her face was pale, her eyes red from the previous days of grief, but there was something in her expression that struck Miss Marple as unnatural. Something guarded, like a woman afraid to say too much. Miss Marple, Lady Eleanor greeted her, her voice shaky but polite. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm. "I've simply come to ask a few more questions. I know this is difficult, but I believe we're all missing something." Andrew, standing near the fireplace, crossed his arms over his chest and shot Miss Marple a pointed glance. "We've already told you everything we know, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I don't see what more there is to say." Miss Marple fixed her gaze on him. "There is much more to say, Mr. Collingwood. I'm sure you've noticed by now that your father's death isn't as simple as it seems. There are things about Sir George's life, his dealings with the Derby estate, that no one has been willing to discuss openly. It's time to stop pretending, Mr. Collingwood." Andrew shifted uneasily, but Miss Marple could see that something in her words had struck a chord. She could tell that her mention of the Derby estate had unsettled him. Lady Eleanor looked up from the piano, her expression becoming more fragile with each passing moment. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? What dealings? What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady and assured, "that your husband's investigation into the Derby estate's past led him to uncover a dangerous truth, and I believe that someone here, someone very close to you, had a vested interest in keeping that truth buried." The room fell silent, and Miss Marple knew that the final piece of the puzzle was beginning to fall into place. Both Lady Eleanor and Andrew were hiding something they were not ready to admit. Miss Marple's next words would reveal whether they were willing to confront the truth. Chapter 8. Another twist. The silence in the drawing-room seemed to stretch longer than it ought to. Miss Marple's words hung in the air like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. Both Lady Eleanor and Andrew remained unmoving, though their expressions betrayed the underlying discomfort. Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve, something deep, perhaps a memory long buried or an uncomfortable truth. Lady Eleanor was the first to break the silence. She lowered her gaze to her hands, twisting the small gold locket she wore around her neck. "You're wrong, Miss Marple," she said softly, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. "There's nothing in the past that could change what happened to George. He was a good man, a respected man. He didn't deserve this." Miss Marple observed her quietly. Lady Eleanor's voice trembled with grief, but there was something else there, something hidden just beneath the surface. Andrew stood nearby, his face a mixture of anger and unease. His hands clenched into fists, and he paced nervously. "Stop, Mother," Andrew said, his voice tight. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to this nonsense. There's no conspiracy, no dark past. We've told you everything there is to know." Miss Marple's eyes followed him as he walked to the window, glancing out into the dark night, his back rigid. The frustration in his voice was unmistakable, but it was his body language that spoke volumes. There was more to his response than simple indignation. Miss Marple could see that he was struggling between loyalty to his family and a growing suspicion that he, too, was being dragged into something far darker than he realized. "I'm not suggesting anything, Andrew," Miss Marple replied quietly. "But there are facts in this story that have not yet come to light, and those facts are linked to the past of this family. The Derby estate, to be precise." Andrew whirled around, his eyes narrowing. "Enough of this. The Derby estate has nothing to do with my father's death. He had a business relationship with them, yes, but it was strictly professional." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, and her voice softened. The Darby estate is not just a business matter, Andrew. Sir George knew something vital, about the Darby's past that someone wanted to keep hidden. That's why he was killed. Andrew's expression faltered for a moment, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. Then, as if to mask his discomfort, he walked back toward the fireplace, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered under his breath, though the words lacked their usual conviction. Lady Eleanor's voice broke through the tension. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? What does any of this have to do with the Darbys? George was simply doing his duty, looking after his family's legacy. Why would anyone want to stop him? I believe your husband stumbled upon something that someone with much to lose wanted to keep buried," Miss Marple said calmly. "Someone knew that Sir George was close to uncovering it, and in their desperation to protect the past, they took drastic measures." Andrew turned sharply toward her, his face flushed with frustration. "I told you already, Miss Marple. That's just not true. It's all a misunderstanding." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, her eyes steady on him. "You know something, Andrew. I can see it in your eyes. You know more than you're saying. This isn't about a simple family quarrel. It's about power, control, and secrets." Andrew's jaw clenched, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple thought he might snap. But instead, he took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as he turned away. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said in a quieter tone, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Miss Marple. But before he could say anything more, Lady Eleanor spoke again, her voice now steady and full of resolve. "Andrew," she said, her tone softer yet insistent, "we cannot keep hiding the truth. It's time. It's time for all of it to come out." Andrew's face twisted in confusion and disbelief. "Mother, don't. You don't know what you're asking." Lady Eleanor's eyes met Miss Marple's, and for the first time in the entire conversation, Miss Marple saw something different in her expression, a mixture of fear and regret. She had been hiding something, and it wasn't just about her grief. There was a deeper guilt there, one that had been eating away at her for years. "Tell her, Andrew," Lady Eleanor said quietly. "Tell her what happened. It's time." Andrew's posture stiffened once more, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. His mother's words seemed to weigh heavily on him, and he was torn between protecting his family's secrets and doing what was right. "There's nothing to tell," Andrew finally muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle tremor in his hands, his clenched fists betraying the facade of calm he tried to maintain. "Andrew, there's always something to tell, and it's always the things we try to bury that come to the surface in the end." At that moment, the door to the drawing room opened with a soft creak, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Griffin, stepped in hesitantly, her face drawn with concern. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," she said, glancing nervously at the family. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe you should see something. It's about Sir George." Miss Marple rose from her seat, her eyes meeting Andrew's and Lady Eleanor's one last time before she walked toward the door. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple wondered if she had pushed them too far. But there was something more at play here, something that had to be revealed, whether they were ready for it or not. "Come along, Mrs. Griffin," Miss Marple said quietly, her mind racing. "Show me what you found." The housekeeper led Miss Marple to a small study at the back of the manor, where a collection of Sir George's private papers had been left untouched. Mrs. Griffin gestured to a pile of documents on a nearby table, her hands trembling. "I found this among his things," Mrs. Griffin said, her voice low. It's a letter, Miss Marple. A letter Sir George had been writing. He didn't finish it, but I believe it has something to do with the Darby family." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she approached the desk. The letter was half finished, the ink still fresh on the page. As she began to read, her eyes widened in realization. The letter was not just a communication, it was a warning. Sir George had uncovered something monumental about the Darby family's hidden past, something that would have torn apart everything the village had known. But the letter was only part of it. The deeper truth, the one that would explain Sir George's murder, was still out there, hidden in the shadows. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Griffin, her face a study of quiet determination. "This is the breakthrough we needed," she said, her voice steady. "And I believe we're very close to uncovering everything." Chapter 9. The Final Thread Miss. Marple sat quietly in the small study, the half-finished letter in her hands, absorbing the weight of its contents. The words on the page were carefully chosen, but there was an unmistakable urgency to Sir George's writing. As her eyes traced the lines, she pieced together a chilling picture. Sir George had been on the verge of uncovering the full extent of the Darby family's hidden transactions, dealings that went back generations. The letter spoke of loans, hidden agreements, and the risks of exposing the truth. It was clear now. Sir George had been murdered not because of a family dispute, but because he had uncovered a secret too dangerous for someone in the village to let him reveal. He had been killed to protect the past, protect something far more valuable than reputation or inheritance. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Griffin, who had remained silently by the door, watching her closely. "You found this among Sir George's things, you say?" The housekeeper nodded, her face pale. "Yes, Miss Marple. I was going through his papers, cleaning up after the investigation, when I came across the letter. It looked like he'd been writing it late the night before. Well, before he was found." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her bag with a deliberate motion. "Thank you, Mrs. Griffin. You've done the right thing bringing this to my attention." Mrs. Griffin gave a small, hesitant nod. "I didn't know what to make of it at first, but now that you're here, I feel like I'm doing something good by helping. Sir George, he was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened." Miss Marple paused for a moment, considering the housekeeper's words. She had no doubt that Mrs. Griffin had been loyal to the family, but there was something in her demeanor, something unspoken, that hinted she had known more than she had let on. But now was not the time to press her. There were others who had far more to hide. "Let me take this letter to the constable," Miss Marple said. "It will help him understand what's at stake here. But there's one more person I need to speak with. I believe we're very close to the truth now, Mrs. Griffin. But I need to confront the person who may be hiding the last piece of this puzzle." Mrs. Griffin nodded, but her eyes flickered with worry. "I do hope you find the answers, Miss Marple. We all need to know the truth." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile and left the study, her mind already racing with the implications of Sir George's letter. The Darby family's dark secrets, carefully buried for decades, were on the verge of being exposed. But who would go to such lengths to protect them? And who stood to gain from Sir George's untimely death? As Miss Marple approached the Collingwood Manor again, the evening air felt heavier than before. She had spent the last few hours reviewing the letter and making her own connections, but now it was time to take her investigation to its final stage. She needed to speak to Andrew Collingwood again. She had observed his behavior closely over the past days, and now, more than ever, Miss Marple was convinced that Andrew held the key to understanding why his father had been murdered. When Miss Marple arrived, Andrew was sitting by the fireplace in the drawing room, his back to her as he stared into the flames. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable. Lady Eleanor, having retreated to her rooms after another long day of mourning, was nowhere to be seen. The house felt empty, as if it had been hollowed out by the loss of Sir George, the man who had once filled every room with his presence. "Mr. Collingwood," Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle yet firm, as she stepped into the room. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Andrew's shoulders stiffened, and he slowly turned to face her. His expression was guarded, but his eyes, those eyes, betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. "What is it, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice strained. "I've been thinking about your father," Miss Marple began, taking a seat opposite him. "And I believe I know what happened." Andrew's face tightened at the mention of his father, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You didn't want anyone to uncover the truth, did you?" Miss Marple continued, her tone soft but unwavering. "Your father was about to expose something dangerous, something that could ruin your family's reputation, your future. You couldn't let him go any further." Andrew's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he looked as if he might speak. But instead, he simply shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice breaking. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I know, Andrew. I know more than you think. Your father had uncovered something about the Darby estate, hadn't he? Something so damaging that you felt you had no choice but to stop him." Andrew's hands tightened into fists, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might lash out. But then, with a deep breath, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping as the fight seemed to leave him. "Yes," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes, I knew what he was getting into. He was about to expose everything, the deals, the loans, the secrets. And I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything we've worked for. You have no idea what it's like to live with a name like ours, to be constantly tied to the past. We've fought to keep it all together, Miss Marple. But Father, he was going to ruin everything." Miss Marple's heart ached for him, but she knew that the truth had to come out. "And so you killed him, Andrew. You didn't mean for it to happen. But when he came close to revealing the Darby family's past, you knew you had no choice." Andrew's face contorted with guilt, but he said nothing. His eyes were wet with tears, and his shoulders shook with the weight of his admission. "I didn't want to, Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "but I didn't know what else to do. Father was right, of course. The Darbys had been hiding things for years, but we couldn't let the truth come out. Not now, not ever." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, allowing him to speak. She had always known that the truth would come from the most unexpected place. But now that it had been revealed, the weight of it seemed almost unbearable. "I understand, Andrew," she said gently. "But your father is gone now, and the truth will come out, whether you want it to or not." Andrew collapsed into the chair, his face buried in his hands. "I never wanted this, Miss Marple. I never meant for him to die. But when it came down to it, I didn't think I had any other choice." Chapter 10. The reveal, the night outside, seemed to press against the windows of the Collingwood Manor, and Miss Marple stood quietly across from Andrew Collingwood as he sank deeper into his chair, his head buried in his hands. The weight of the confession hung in the air, almost suffocating, but Miss Marple remained calm, her expression steady as she processed the full scope of Andrew's admission. This was the moment she had suspected would come, the moment when the truth finally surfaced, raw and unrepentant. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. It was a sharp contrast to the somber atmosphere between them. Despite the tumult of emotions that swirled in Andrew's eyes, Miss Marple knew that this moment of revelation was necessary. The truth had been a long time coming, and though it had come at a great cost, it was the only way to unravel the tangled web of deception that had surrounded Sir George's death. After a long silence, Miss Marple spoke again, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You didn't want to, Andrew. I know that. But in your mind, you saw no other way." Andrew finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears, and nodded in a mixture of guilt and relief. "I thought I could stop it. I thought I could protect the family from everything. But it was all falling apart. And when Father started looking into the Darbys again, I knew it was over. He was getting too close." Miss Marple allowed him a moment to gather himself, her gaze softening with understanding. But she knew this was not the time to offer him comfort. He had made his choices, and the consequences were already set in motion. "You feared that if your father exposed the Darby estate's secrets, it would destroy everything you had worked to protect. Your family's reputation, your future, the legacy of the Collingwoods. But in the end, Andrew, it was your actions that sealed your father's fate." Andrew winced, as though the words struck him physically, and for a moment he seemed to shrink under their weight. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I couldn't let him ruin everything. We couldn't afford for the Darby family's secrets to come out. I never wanted him to die, Miss Marple. But once I saw how determined he was, I lost control." Miss Marple took a steadying breath, her mind now firmly focused on the final task ahead. "You didn't want him dead, but you acted out of desperation. That night, when you confronted him in the study, I believe it was then that things spiraled out of control. Perhaps you thought you could stop him from going any further without realizing what you were doing." Andrew's face hardened again, his expression a mixture of sorrow and regret. "Yes, I confronted him. But it was supposed to be just a warning, to tell him to back off, to let it go. But he didn't listen. He couldn't. And that's when I lost it." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind tracing the details. The study had been where Sir George had been closest to the truth. The letter he had been writing, the discussions with his family about the Darbys. It all made sense now. The confrontation, the heated words, the realization that Andrew's future was on the line. In that moment of panic, he had acted out of fear of losing everything. "I understand, Andrew," Miss Marple said quietly. "But the truth, as always, has a way of finding its way out. Your father's investigation would have exposed the Darby family's secrets, but now it's you who have exposed them." Andrew looked at her, his face pale and defeated. "What do I do now, Miss Marple? What's left for me?" "Now," Miss Marple said firmly, "you must face the consequences of your actions. But in doing so, you will ensure that the truth about your father's death is known. And perhaps, in time, the Darby family's secrets will no longer hold power over your family." At that moment, the door creaked open, and Constable Pierce stepped into the room, his face set with determination. He had been waiting outside, but Miss Marple had known that the time had come. The investigation was now complete. The truth had been revealed, and justice was about to be served. Andrew Collingwood, Constable Pierce said, his voice steady. "You are under arrest for the murder of your father, Sir George Collingwood." Andrew stood slowly, his face a mixture of shame and resignation. He did not resist as the constable moved forward, placing the cuffs on his wrists. The weight of his actions was finally catching up with him, and as the constable led him away, Miss Marple remained seated, watching the scene unfold before her. Lady Eleanor, who had been standing just outside the door, entered the room, her face pale and drawn. She had overheard everything. Her eyes were red from grief, but there was a quiet strength in them now, as though she had come to terms with the truth. "Is it done?" Lady Eleanor asked softly, her voice breaking slightly. "Missy—" Marple nodded, her eyes compassionate yet. A moment. Miss Marple thought he might lash out. But then, with a deep breath, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping as the fight seemed to leave him. "Yes," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes." I knew what he was getting into. He was about to expose everything. The deals, the loans, the secrets. And I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything we've worked for. You have no idea what it's like to live with a name like ours. To be constantly tied to the past. We've fought to keep it all together, Miss Marple. But Father, he was going to ruin everything. Miss Marple's heart ached for him, but she knew that the truth had to come out. "And so you killed him, Andrew. You didn't mean for it to happen." But when he came close to revealing the Darby family's past, you knew you had no choice. Andrew's face contorted with guilt, but he said nothing. His eyes were wet with tears, and his shoulders shook with the weight of his admission. "I didn't want to, Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "but I didn't know what else to do. Father was right, of course. The Darbys had been hiding things for years, but we couldn't let the truth come out. Not now, not ever." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, allowing him to speak. She had always known that the truth would come from the most unexpected place. But now that it had been revealed, the weight of it seemed almost unbearable. "I understand, Andrew," she said gently. "But your father is gone now, and the truth will come out, whether you want it to or not." Andrew collapsed into the chair, his face buried in his hands. "I never wanted this, Miss Marple. I never meant for him to die. But when it came down to it, I didn't think I had any other choice."